So as promised, our last environmental video is about the value of statistical life. This is a concept that I, it's near and dear to me in an academic sense. My advisor at graduate school was one of the originators of this idea, of this tool. So I'm a pretty big supporter of the idea, but I acknowledge that on its face, it sounds pretty crazy. I've done research looking at how do we think about the benefits of regulations that protect the lives of children, especially young children. So what am I doing? I'm actually trying to come up with a dollar figure for how much we benefit by saving the life of a young child. That's kind of crazy, right? You're probably thinking, I'm taking a moral issues class from someone who does research on a price level for dead babies. Something doesn't seem right. So what am I doing with the VSL? Well, specifically there, I was looking at car seats, and a special feature about 10 years ago, you could pay a premium for a child car seat that had something called side impact protection. It was a little bit safer, especially when those side impact collisions, which are the most deadly car collisions, happen. These seats are supposed to protect from those side impact crashes in a better way than your standard car seat. So they tend to cost a little bit more. So I looked at what that price premium was. It was about 20 bucks extra for this feature in your car seat at the time. And I look at you know, how many people buy these things, and how much safer is it based on all the car crash test data. And yeah, we have agencies here in the U.S., National Highway Transportation Safety Agency, NHTSA. They have similar ones in Europe and Japan and other places. So looking at these data from different countries that have slightly different standards on side impact protection, how much safer are you in a car seat that has this additional safety feature? By taking those two pieces, that small change in safety and the premium people are willing to pay for that, parents willing to pay 20 bucks extra to have this additional safety feature for their kids, we can actually come up with a value of statistical life. And so it was at that time about $14–15 million was the number that came out of that calculation. So what does that mean? It means that that $20 premium for a tiny change in the safety level of a kid riding in a car equated to the statistical average for an expected death. People were willing to pay about $15 million for, which is actually a premium over what adults are willing to pay for changes in their own safety, which is closer to $9 or $10 million on average. These are all averages. Your personal choices may be quite different, but the VSL is a statistical average looking at how much people are willing to pay to reduce their risk level a little bit, or how much you have to pay them to take on a little bit more risk. So that the most common place to look for this measure is to look at the labor market. How much more do you have to pay someone to take a slightly riskier job? Maybe you're looking at someone in construction and you want them to start working in roofing, which is a little bit more dangerous than general construction because you're up on a roof and there are falls, lightning strikes, other things like that. So you might have to pay them a little bit extra to take that riskier job, right? So we look at that risk premium you have to pay people. That can also be used to calculate this value of statistical life. It's a really important figure because I mentioned we do a lot of cost-benefit analysis. What are the benefits we get from reducing pollution? Well, we're going to save lives. There's uncertainty. We don't know exactly how many, but we expect maybe reducing sulfur oxides in car emissions might save 200 lives per year. And it would cost us, there's some uncertainty, but say $220 million to install new technologies that will prevent these sulfur oxides from coming out of car tailpipes. So that means $220 million cost increase. It's going to go to, the auto companies are going to have to pay a little bit more. They're going to lose out on some of their profits. It also means consumers are going to pay a little bit more. Cars will be a little more expensive, right? And so we've got this cost that both consumers and producers are bearing. The benefit, it's lives saved, and we might have some idea of what those lives would look like, but that doesn't tell us how to weigh it against $220 million in added cost. So a VSL allows us to do that. It allows us to say, okay, if we expect to save 100 lives, the value of statistical life is, say, $10 million. So we can take that 10 million, add 2 zeros for the 100 lives saved. We get 100 million, $1 billion. So we have $1 billion in benefits of expecting to save, say, 100 lives. Then we can compare that to the $220 million in expected costs. We have dollars on both sides, so we can actually make sense of comparing these things against each other. That's why the VSL is important. It allows us to kind of systematically think about these tough trade-offs that come up in the environmental context. Lives versus, well, it isn't always lives. Think of it as kind of a nicer environment versus more economic activity. That's kind of the core trade-off. And so more economic activity, that's measured in dollars. A nicer environment, well, that is tough to measure, and that gets to the issues we talked about already about intrinsic value, instrumental value. Economists focus on instrumental value because we can actually measure that and put dollars to it. That way we can compare it to the cost side of the ledger. So obviously there are moral issues that come up with things like value of statistical life. One of the big controversies about 12 years ago, the George W. Bush administration, for a little while, the Environmental Protection Agency, the big environmental agency, it said, well, let's think about these lives that we're saving from, say, a reduction in air pollution. Some of these lives are people who are older, who had underlying conditions, maybe COPD or severe asthma. They're 75, 85 years old. Those seem different than if we have a 30-year-old dying from a cancer they got from air pollution, right? So the George W. Bush EPA said, let's use a different value of statistical life for elderly than we do for general population. That's actually, my research came out of this idea that, we may think about these things differently. I was a new parent at the time, and I thought, man, I'm much more willing to pay for my daughter's safety than my own safety. So that's where my research came from about actually a higher VSL for children based on parents' willingness to pay. But the flip side of that, at least for the Bush EPA, was, well, for seniors, we should probably use a lower number. And that was very contentious, a lot of pushback. You can imagine groups like the AARP really didn't like the idea that we're discounting deaths if they happen to seniors versus other people. This may sound like kind of a familiar debate. Hopefully it does, because it's been revived in many ways with the COVID pandemic. Because again, here we see something that has a much more severe prognosis if you are in some of these elderly underlying condition sort of categories. And so how do we think about COVID deaths if they're young people where that's quite rare, or elderly where we have a lot of COVID deaths of 75 plus, right? And getting into managed care facilities, COVID can wreak havoc and kill a lot of people. Do we think about those deaths differently than we think about deaths if they're school-age children, or if they're, prime working age, 50-year-olds? Those are tough. Those are tough moral issues. The the standard federal agency in the US take on it, there was so much pushback to that attempt by the EPA 12 years ago that they've gone back to all federal agencies at the moment use a uniform value of statistical life. But it'll be interesting to see if coming out of this COVID pandemic, there may be another push for kind of a senior discount if the people who are getting killed are elderly and they had shorter life expectancy to start with. We might think quite a bit differently about them. So